Welcome to Coasts as Muse, which is the first of the new year of the IHR Partnership Seminar Series, supported by the Institute for Historical Research at the University of London. I'm James Louis Smith. I'm of University College Cork, and I'm going to be just the facilitator of this, and our chair is going to be Melanie Bassett of Portsmouth. So essentially, this series comes out of a sort of COVID era 2020 sort of situation where the IHR has a very long, proud tradition of seminars, often in the Senate House building in London, which some of you may be familiar with, but they wanted to continue that online, have new conversations, bring in a wider audience. And we proposed Coastal Connections, which is this seminar series, as a contribution to that. And we've got a wide variety of connections and perspectives that you can have a look at on their website. And I'll drop a link in once Mel started. But I think it's, no, it's not on the slide, but I can drop it. Oh, yes, it is. I can drop it in there anyway for you for the chat. Just to talk about, we're going to be doing a series of panel-based short talks, and then there's going to be a Q&A. Just to say that our policy with Q&A is that we ask that you ask your questions in the chat, and we'll call them out rather than unmuting yourself. And I would also ask people to keep themselves muted for the duration. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Mel to begin Coastal's News.
Thank you, Louis. I'm Mel Bassett. I am a research fellow at the University of Portsmouth. The topic Coast of Muse has come up because, you know, it's really interesting to see how the coast and the sea has permeated our cultural consciousness. And so the panel that I've sort of gathered here today have examples of how the coast permeates that culture in different ways, and whether that's through their own writing and their own illustrations, their voyages of discovery to understand contemporary culture, or whether that's to catalogue what has been written about the coast or represent it in a digital form on a map, and try to make sense of the literary heritage and also the contemporary culture of the coast and sort of coastal cities and settings. I think it's a really nice way to think about how we can tag the idea of the coast onto ideas of you know, of books, you know, as a broad theme, but also, you know, this is very sort of multimedia and a interdisciplinary way about looking at the coast as a theme for research. So I'm really pleased to be joined today by Dr. Tom Sykes and Dr. Louis Netter from the University of Portsmouth. And they are authors of a new travelogue called The Coast of Teeth. And they'll be telling you a bit about the 12 English coastal towns that they've been traveling around and sort of investigating with this travelogue. Then we'll be speaking to Anna Ildner, who is the librarian of a sea library, which she's established in Jamala, on the coast of Latvia. So this is another way that the sea has inspired not just literary works, but also Anna herself to be able to put forward this wonderful idea and curate this wonderful library of literary works. And then Dr. Maggie Bowers, who is also from the University of Portsmouth, and she will be introducing you to a project that her and a colleague of hers, Dr. Mark Frost, has been putting together at the University of Portsmouth, which is to put together a literary map, which is a sort of a digital asset which brings together the literary past of Portsmouth, but also its contemporary writers and creatives as well. And I can see some of them are here today as well. So I can see Christine Lawrence in the audience. So I would just like to say thank you to all my speakers for joining us, and I will introduce you first of all to Tom and Louis. Tom, Tom is a senior lecturer in creative writing and journalism in the School of Film, Media and Communication at the University of Portsmouth, and he's a prolific travel writer and commentator, and he's published in The New Statesman, in Private Eye, The Scotsman, The Telegraph, and lots of other digital media, as well as his own monographs as well, and travelogue books, particularly on the Philippines. And Louis is a senior lecturer in illustration at the School of Art, Design and Performance at the University of Portsmouth. And Louis is a widely published illustrator, comic maker and animator. And his works are also, interestingly, collected by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Library of Congress, and many other library collections in the US as well. And his animations have been selected for the Coney Island Film Festival and the Williamsburg International Film Festival. So I will stop sharing my screen and I will hand over to Tom and Louis. Thank you.
Tom, you're going first, right? I thought.
No, you're going first, I thought.
Oh, sorry. I thought I was going.
I don't mind. I can go first if you want. I'd rather.
No, that's right. Sorry, I thought you were going first. That's cool.
Fantastic start. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Our ongoing research project entitled Coast of Teeth is an exploration of English seaside towns through drawing and writing. My own role as a reportage artist is to respond what I see and document it in situ. What we have found on our travels to Torquay, Paignton, Bournemouth, Clacton-on-Sea, Jaywick, and Weston-super-Mare are landscapes which are reflective of the socioeconomic realities on the ground and of people who bear the trauma of such conditions in their behaviors and physicality. You did mention 11 towns and so forth. We're not quite complete with the project, so we will be going to other towns within England. Internal conflict manifests itself in physical conditions such as obvious physical disability, antisocial behavior, obesity, and malnutrition from drug use. Working with a writer, it is interesting to see how the writing and the drawing speaks to internal and external realities and the convergence of past and present as an evolving circumstance for people in these towns who struggle for relevance and economic sustenance. Contemporary reportage drawing is noted for its diversity of subject matter. However, at the heart of all of this practice is an interest in what drawing does in capturing human experience. Reportage drawing is about the imperfections and limitations of the hand, and in much reportage, the limitations or circumstances imposed upon human subjects in modern capitalist environs. In this work, people and places inhabit each other, and neglect is not just a concept, it becomes physical and material in drawing. Although diverse in terms of architecture, social and economic circumstances, seaside towns share an aspect of neglect in large homeless populations and are peripheric in their lack of sustaining industry and opportunity. Neglect breeds resilience, but also disconnection. In this disconnection, we have seen these towns turn inward and sometimes downward. The subject of reportage drawing is firstly always about drawing. It is unavoidable. The qualities of the drawing assert themselves because they are the code that we must break to understand the image. Because reportage drawings in particular are done in situ and quickly, they look and feel like sketches, and therefore their formation reflects the immediacy of vision. This is not always true, as drawings are done with residual memory and not always from direct observation. However, the spirit of the drawing reflects something observed. Vision is the genesis of the image, and experience is how the scene becomes something felt. The drawing is then a rendered idea, a construction. Drawings done in Torquay, Bournemouth, and Clacton/Jaywick quickly present to the viewer widely different populations with different experiences. What connects them, however, is the seaside, the strip of contemplation between land and sea. between what was and what is. It is hard to disconnect the English seaside from a kind of self-induced nostalgia trip. Like all nostalgia, nostalgic remembrance, or imagining, it is often tinged with melancholy, something these drawings also evoke. Coast of Teeth, in both its written and drawn forms, relies on walking and observing with little planned or prescribed. In this sense, our methodology reflects the derive of the psychogeographer. Multiple efforts have been made to clarify the aims of this movement, but Guy Debord put it succinctly as psychogeography could set for itself the study of the precise laws and specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organized or not, on the emotions and behavior of individuals. Our methodology requires a lot of walking and seeing how landscapes change along the coast. This is measured in changes to the geography, architecture, and people. We equally move inland, exploring how these towns operate the further you get away from leisure centers. We found in both areas that people are wearing the burden of life on their faces and bodies, and towns bear the marks of neglect in closed stores and social ills in corner stores called News and Booze that sell overproof alcohol, something neither myself or Tom had ever heard of. It is a landscape of beauty and desperation. There are lives lived in the cracks between past and present, and capitalism's violent and careless swings. Drawing allows us a human lens from which to see. Drawings which capture the experience of seeing and witnessing. A drawing is an empathetic dialogue with the viewer. It invites participation and recreation. In these drawings, we can easily understand the singular visions, but they work best as a collection, a psychic portrait of a locale. They are rooted in observation, but they are deliberate constructions, made at the point when seeing becomes looking and looking becomes feeling. In text and image, Coast of Teeth is aiming to do something different, or at least something that hasn't been done in some time. The notable collaborations between writer and artist, such as those between Hunter S. Thompson and Ralph Steadman, reveal that text and image can have a charging effect on one another. Neither merely complement the other, they riff off each other and propel shared textures of experience. This is what we intend, though a much soberer effort. Baudrillard is a writer for me who manages to capture in writing what the image often does when seen as text. In particular, his exploration of America, a place I know well, is evocative, like a Basquiat painting, letting ideas merge with effortless ease, seemingly chaotic but urgent and dead-eyed. In his wide-ranging meditation on America called America, he notes America is a primitive society, the same motor identification, the same collective fantasy of an unfolding ritual, breakfast, movie, religious service, love and death, the whole life as a drive-in, truly magnificent. All drawings function as provocations. They claim to be something of reality, but they are just dirt marks and scrawls. When assembled in the mind, they, like a piece of poetry, cobble the realms of the real and imagined and make something new, something that approximates not life, but the experience of life, something the psychogeographers perhaps desired. Michael Taussig writes of the struggle to capture essential impressions and how they get dogged by revisitation. He notes, what happens when notes are written up is what I call afterthoughts kick in. By afterthoughts, I mean secondary elaborations that arise on top of the original notes, photographs, and drawings. Through stops and starts and sudden swerves, the original is pulled into a wider and wilder landscape. Taussig sees the inevitability of this, but laments this loss. Reportage drawings avoid this revision and often retain the momentary insights that are so often lost in the construction of writing. Still, this desire to wrestle the observed and felt in the drawing is ever present, and many contemporary reportage artists strive for the quickest, most effective, and most crystallizing method for relaying vision and experience in the quick marks of a pencil.
Tom, you're on mute.
Hi, sorry, is that better? Can you hear me? Sorry, stuff was going weird on my screen. I couldn't find anything. Okay, well, hello everybody. I just want to compliment what Louis was saying a little bit by what I'm going to say to you. Louis was talking about some of the sort of techniques and methodologies that we've used on the ground to try and sort of gather information about seaside towns, and then also in terms of sort of how we've represented them in our writing and illustration respectively. I wanted to complement that by talking a little bit about some of the, I suppose, sort of conceptual models and, dare I say, theories that we've developed in order to understand how seaside towns work and sort of operate. I want to just sort of, if I just begin with an idea from the psychogeographers. Louis mentioned psychogeography, one of my favorite writers, and an educated audience will know his work, Ian Sinclair. Him and another writer called Nick Papadimitriou are very interested in what they call edgelands, which are areas in Britain. Their focus is sort of exclusively Britain, that seem to kind of muddy the boundaries between the rural and the urban, the country and the city. And as a result of that, there are certain kind of interesting kind of ambiguities and contradictions that come out of that, in terms of everything from sort of town planning to the ways in which people, this informs the identity of people living in those sorts of edgelands. And I think, and edgelands are defined by their sort of in-betweenness between those two conditions. I think in a similar way, you can apply that thinking to seaside towns, as Louis again was kind of suggesting. Seaside towns are also liminal spaces between the land and the sea. And we think, in our experience of traveling to these places and writing about them and trying to understand them, that that sort of in-betweenness of seaside towns gives rise to certain contradictions between things like wealth and poverty, fun and frivolity, yet misery and despair, familiarity and alienness, notions about the past and the present, fact and fantasy, and the national and the international. And just to sort of give you some kind of examples to illustrate what I'm talking about, certain seaside towns have struck us as being almost like checkpoints on a sort of porous border. In other words, these are places that, by dint of being both spatially and sort of conceptually on the edges of England, have somehow kind of imported or drawn in certain kind of unusual, or at least sort of un-English, according to various kind of stereotypes and perhaps sort of even myths to do with what sort of England is and its identity. They've drawn in sort of facets of foreign culture or aspects of overseas in a sort of interesting and unusual way. So I'll give you a couple of examples that one is kind of is sort of almost quite banal, and the other is more serious. And more serious one is when we went to the Essex coastal towns of Jaywick and St Osyth, we found trailer parks and sort of shanty town type dwellings, and a sort of a depth of poverty that we had never seen in Britain, or indeed I don't think I'd seen in the West. Louis and I have both traveled extensively in the global South and in Africa and Asia, areas like that, and we'd only seen that kind of poverty in those sorts of places before we went to this particular part of Essex. So there was a sense of, yes, something of the developing world or the global South being kind of drawn into a part of England when we went there. On a sort of more banal level, on a more trivial level, you might say, we've been struck by the number of seaside amusements, arcade games that kind of invoke some idea of the foreign exotic, references to the Wild West of the USA, in sort of arcade halls and things like that. Egyptian pharaohs and Aztec emperors always seem to feature in gambling. I don't know why there should be that reference, but as I say, it speaks to some sort of notion that you find in seaside towns of a kind of exotic other. The converse of that idea is that some seaside towns can be sort of metaphorical fortresses or bulwarks against the rest of the world. And I think this is particularly relevant in the age of Brexit, in an age of imperialist nostalgia. where I'm speaking to you from now, Southsea, also part of the world where I grew up, was created really in the early 19th century as a seaside town, as a seaside resort. But it's long been surrounded by a large naval base, barracks, and coastal turrets. You might say this is a kind of an aggressive or a hostile topography. And I think that that has perhaps shaped a sort of certain paranoia that's sometimes present in this town throughout history. You can trace through history about sort of foreign invasion, foreign incursion. In the 1860s and 70s, so-called Palmerston's Follies, these sort of turrets, castle sort of fortresses, were built around Portsmouth out of this fear of French attack, which turned out to be misplaced, turned out to be false. More recently, I think this kind of suspicion or this fear of the outside or the world beyond, you know, the seaside, as it were, beyond England, has manifested itself in certain kind of political discourses, politicians that will remain unnamed at the moment, I think probably best, who have sort of pushed resentment towards refugees. Portsmouth being a port town, has always had refugees and asylum seekers and people moving in from abroad. And some of these politicians have sort of made, you know, misleading statements about, you know, the fear of Turkish ascension to the EU in recent years. Another sort of concept that sort of interested us, based on our sort of observations of going to certain seaside towns, is this notion that when you get away from these sort of metropolitan centres of education and the media, thinking particularly London and the major cities, inland cities in Britain or England, because our focus in the book is really just English seaside towns, you get a sense that when you get that sort of distance from the sort of metropolitan centre, sometimes you can find certain sort of fringe delusions and eccentric beliefs manifest themselves. If you walk from really from Bournemouth to Christchurch along that part of the coast of Dorset, you'll almost find a kind of anti-vax graffiti trail, a photograph referring to it there. Benches, public toilets, other sorts of structures will be daubed with these sort of anti-vaccination sort of slogans and so forth. In Torquay, I've never seen a museum quite like this, the Real Crime Museum. It has an exhibition, a permanent exhibition, again, you can see the photo referring to it there, pushing Princess Diana murder conspiracy theories. And again, I've not seen that in museums in London or anywhere in sort of inland England. we're also interested in sort of when certain popular ideas or imaginings of seaside towns start to kind of supersede the material reality of seaside towns. And I know this from my own experience because I grew up on Hayling Island, which is next door to Portsmouth. And it was a very popular seaside destination for many years until the 1970s and 80s. And like a lot of other seaside towns, it started to decline for a number of reasons, partly because British people found that they could go to Spain instead cheaply and be guaranteed fine weather and get all the things that they'd expect to find in England, English fish and chips, English beer, etc., but in a place where they would have sort of guaranteed good weather, which you unfortunately don't get necessarily in this country. So at exactly the time that Hayling Island starts to decline materially as a seaside town, this funny sort of collective fantasy started to emerge of a sort of seaside paradise. And I was there, man, I remember it, you know, so I have kind of, you know, direct inward experience of this. It was partly, and again, a number of different, you know, my generation of people sort of born and raised at that sort of time on Hayling started to drive sort of VW Beetles around, get into surfing and bodyboarding and things like that. A lot of this was inspired by the extraordinary popularity of Australian soap operas, things like Home and Away and Neighbours. But of course, the reality was less glamorous. The waves weren't big enough. These were not Bondi Beach type waves, right? The weather was often not really conducive to sitting on the beach, lounging around, doing whatever people would do in these sort of Australian soap operas. And so then a strange thing happened whereby a lot of my people of my generation, when they got older, they sort of wanted to visit Australia. There was this huge fad, perhaps it's still going on, I'm not sure, of young British people wanting to spend time in Australia. It's from the sort of 1990s and 2000s. And in a sense, these people wanted to go to Australia to try and find, in a sense, the real hailing, to try and find some kind of almost authentication of the fantasy that had been created on Hailing Island based on Australian soap operas and media and things like that. So there's a sort of strange kind of thinking going on there, can sometimes happen with regards to Seaside Towns. I'll just finish by saying a little bit about how Louis and I have observed in some of these places that we've been to, what seem to be the sort of normal laws of time and space and scale and size and aesthetics that seem to apply elsewhere in this country, don't apply necessarily always in seaside towns. We can think of, for example, Torquay's motley skyline, which is a bizarre sort of postmodern collage of different architectural styles and periods. There are these kind of Mediterranean style or Latin style sort of stucco apartments. I think Louis, being American, likened them very evocatively to something out of Miami Vice, if anyone remembers that. Then you've got next to that the Anglo-Indian domes of the pavilion, very different sort of architectural style. And then there's a modernistic church, and then there are deserted shops. Unfortunately, you will be witnessing the slow death of Britain's high streets if that in many ways seaside towns are on the kind of front line of that, or that's where it seems to be happening really badly. Similarly, in Ventnor and the Isle of Wight, history and chronology have also sort of fragmented in interesting ways. You'll see an uncanny jumble of, there's a 1960s themed diner and a 1960s themed pub with sort of pictures of, Michael Caine and the Beatles and all this kind of stuff. Next to Victorian homes, Georgian homes, modern American style eateries, Burger King, sort of burger joints and things like that. Again, it's a sort of a strange mishmash. Also interesting when you look at sort of issues around sort of ideas around scale and size and so forth. In God's Hill, which is nearby on the Isle of Wight, you have what is probably the most interesting model village that I've ever seen. Model villages seem to be a kind of, well, I've only ever seen them in seaside towns in England. They seem to be almost exclusive to seaside towns. But in God's Hill, you've got this bizarre kind of model village within a model village within a model village, which can make you feel like you've sort of entered this eerie parallel universe, kind of like an episode of The Twilight Zone or something. And I think really these sorts of quirks, these oddities, are some distance, again, spatially and conceptually, visually, from what is increasingly becoming a kind of uniform English interior. The philosopher Julian Baggini talks about every towns, this idea that you go into one of these edgelands that people like Sinclair talk about, and it's the same kind of red brick housing. It's the same, there'll be the same kind of huge carpet superstore there, a McDonald's there, a Burger King there. In other words, maybe the ways in which globalized capitalism has sort of manifested itself in England in recent years. And so I'll just end my bit with a sort of question, and maybe this could be a little bit of a prompt for the sort of discussion that's going to come later. In this increasingly standardized, homogenized, globalized world, and England more specifically, could it be that seaside towns are amongst the last outposts of oddity, individuality, and the eccentrically passé? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tom and Louis. That was really interesting, and it's nice to see the Coasters Muse as actual a dystopia rather than a utopia as well. I think there's something in the otherness of coastal regions also being as provoking, the deprivation and the strangeness, as much as whether it's a utopia or an idyll. So thank you for that. Again, we'll have questions and discussions at the end, so if anyone would like to post any questions in the chat as they come, please do. But now it's my extreme pleasure to introduce Anna Ildner, and she is a librarian of her very own sea library. She has collected over over 500, nearly 600 books, which she houses in her home on the Latvian coast of Jurmala. And I was looking on her website the other day, and she has also just recently announced that she has got a contract to write a book about her experience of creating her own sea library. And I was really interested in the whole concept of it and the idea that it's so intertextual in a way, because they're books about the sea, but also when we think in terms of coast, it becomes a coastal history because it's a land-based culture that is influenced by the sea. So there's a process going on there which is really, really interesting. And so I'm really, really pleased to introduce Anna, all the way speaking to us from Latvia. Anna, if you'd like to put up your PowerPoint, and then we'll begin when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Anna Ildner from Latvia. I live with my family in a seaside town of Jurmala. This city is built on a dune by the Baltic Sea, and I have opened a sea library here. And how did it all start? I blame the sea. It put a spell on me. Ever since I started to live here, it made me curious. What will it look like tomorrow? I kept coming back. I noticed other water gazers doing the same, arriving at the beach, standing where the land runs out and looking at the big blue sea. But look, here come more crowds, writes Herman Melville in Moby Dick, pacing straight for the water and seemingly bound for a dive. Strange. Nothing will content them but the extremest limit of the land. They must get just as nigh the water as they possibly can without falling in, and there they stand. I've noticed in many books the eyes of those who look out at sea. Those eyes often are in the color of the sea itself. Has sea affected them, I wonder? Do we become changed by the sea? I love to imagine a long and timeless beach where all the sea lovers from books and stories stand and gaze at the horizon. Here's Stephen from James Joyce's Ulysses walking down the beach. There's Moomin family collecting white shells for Mom's garden. And there's Hemingway's old man Santiago pushing his boat into the dawn. It's dangerous to look straight at the sun. It's said you can become mad by looking at full moon for too long. But what about the sea? What happens if you look at it too much? There is this magnetic pull appearing in many books. Sea is a cradle of life. Many of us feel at home when close to it. We feel better. I do. It's said that only in Romanticism people started to look at the sea itself, to appreciate the beauty of it. Soon the sea became something healthy too. As Jonathan Raban writes in the introduction of the Oxford Book of the Sea, just as sea was being recognized as sublime, so it was beginning to be seen as healthful. Sublime sea merges with the therapeutic sea. The new seaside holiday drastically changed the way in which the sea was conventionally viewed, writes Raban. Working-class fishermen beaches became pastoral places, mostly for the rich. It's how my city was born too, on mud spas, on sea bathing and the development of trains, actually on feeling better by the sea. For a short while, I earned money for new books by writing guides about Jurmala for tourists. I wrote about sea air for lungs, aromatherapy of pines, many benefits of walking bare feet on sand. And yet in books, there's so much more. The longer I live here and the more I read, I start to silently believe in sea gods. There's something sacred about the wild sea, its beauty, its power. In ancient Greek epics, outsider Achilles went to the beach to cry his anger out. In the culture of Oceania, beach is a sacred place for inner transformation. Because the beach itself is transforming, a marginal place, as Rachel Carson says. Today, a little more land may belong to the sea, tomorrow, a little less, she writes. Always the edge of the sea remains an elusive and indefinable boundary. Beach is a place for surprises. Everything you find looks ancient and mysterious, writes Tim Winton from Australia. Things brought home from the sea and its margins become emblems, talismans to the beachcomber, he writes. Coast is a place for chance, for the unexpected. You never know what the sea will look like today, as you never know what you might lose or maybe find. You stuff your pockets full of smooth black pebbles, of driftwood, dragons, sea glass, feathers, souvenirs from your own seaside travels, and it's time to go home. Being away from the sea is also a part of sea literature. It's this push and pull, our own inner tides, longing for the sea. I can't stay here forever is a phrase I sigh to gulls and crows when I have to leave. As Derek Walcott wrote, when he left the beach, the sea was still going on. In the magnificent books by Philip Hoare, there's this restlessness when you're not by the sea, and an irrational fear of sea suddenly gone. With tides, it does disappear and appear. I don't live right by the sea. I can hear it on stormy days and smell it if the wind is right, but I don't see it from my window. I have to cycle as far as the ocean in average is deep, 4 kilometers. I once was very jealous of a house tucked behind dune with romantic towers and seaward windows. I wanted to be that house, or at least to live in one, until I realized that this straight Olga Street to the sea and back has given me ideas. The idea of the sea library was born somewhere in the middle of our house and the sea, on the road in between. I'm born in a city of pavements and streets and lived in apartments for my first 30 years. To suddenly own an old house with a garden is an adventure in itself. The house changed the way I wanted to spend my days. I left my previous job and became a sea librarian. I changed trains and planes to a bicycle and books. I changed crossing the seas to standing at the edge of the sea and returning each morning at this very same spot. This 100 years riverside house changed me. Keep some room in your heart for the unimaginable, wrote American poet Mary Oliver, who lived by the sea. In the beginning, there was a room in this house with no purpose. For a while it was a bedroom, for a while it was my eldest son's room, but the furniture kept floating around the house and this room kept losing its name. When I left my job and started to walk to the sea every day, I started to buy and borrow books about it. It's here where I kept them, in the room with no name yet. I kept reading and reading, from Homer to Joyce, from Joyce to Hemingway, Oscar Wilde, Virginia Woolf, Herman Melville, anything I could find about the sea, and one book led me to many others. I was curious to see how writers are dealing with this question of why we keep coming back to the sea, and how they are dealing with describing the ever-changing beauty of the sea. Will they not run out of words, I wondered. Little did I know how many books there are about the sea and how very different. How many are being published today and even written right now at this moment. My lonely wanderings and wanderings turned into an instinct to join a secret crowd of water gazers around the world who love to write and who love to read. With first 100 books collected on my shelves, in the summer of 2018, I opened the doors. I called this room the Sea Library. There had never been a plan to start an institution, a real library, as some say. The Sea Library grew inside this house and is part of me and my life. Yes, it's still just a room in this house, a room with a name now, and yet it's so much more. The floodgates of the wonder world swung open. From the moment on when this room was announced as an open library, books, letters, and gifts started to flow into it, something I didn't expect at all. All I wanted was to share my books. But there are so many who want to share their own stories about the sea and coast, and I'm here to listen. There are artworks and postcards covering the walls of the Sea Library. I have treasures like mermaid's purse, a sliver from John Steinbeck's boat, big seashells from islands I've never been to. Coast and sea is a muse. I'm crocheted corals that grow in corners of this room. I'm weaving bookmarks inspired by the sea. It's a library and an inspiration for me as well. After first postcards and letters, soon visitors followed. Families with kids who want to be pirates, an old retired captain who brought black and white photos with him, a marine biologist who explores streams, a kayaker who loves lighthouses, visitors from nearest towns and even farthest lands. Everyone has a story to tell and a book to give. Each has her own set of sea skills. Some know how to sail, how to swim long distances, or how to paint the sea. Some understand the classification of all its animals, while others turn seaweed into delicious meals. Some, like me, are here just to read and marvel at all this wonderful world of the sea. At first, I thought I will become a forgotten loner moving away from the city, very far from the center. Turned out it was the other way around. Sea, just like stories, unites in the most magical ways. And just as a Tongan and Fijian writer has said, the sea is our pathway to each other and to everyone else. The sea is our endless saga. The sea is our most powerful metaphor, the ocean in us. Many books tell about sailing adventures, stories of crossing the dangerous waters. I am amazed by the brevity of sailors, while I myself was desperately afraid of another vector, of the depths of the sea. As Mary Claire Beaulieu writes, the sea is a solid horizontal plane and a liquid vertical abyss, a surface on which to sail forward and a chasm in which to sink down. Before I opened the library, I was very afraid to swim. But in the first summer of the library, I learned how to do that and have been swimming ever since. I'm still not a good swimmer, but yet I'm there inside the sea. The depths of the sea are real, a home for a large part of this world's inhabitants, but we also need for the sea to be deep as a mirror for our own inner life. I must admit I'm turned into a dreamer here by the sea, letting myself read books deep into the night, just like a kid. I said no to a good salary and a good job in the city in order to have more time with my own children and a time to explore what ideas will I find here at the coast. Yes, I blame the sea again, in the best possible way. Hasn't it changed you as well? And yet, it's by the sea where I am most awake. In this ancient world of the coast, nothing is fixed, everything changes. It's inspiring and frightening at the same time. Whenever I swim, I can drown. Whenever I spy on seaside houses, I know they can be swept away one day. A couple of weeks ago, we counted fallen pines with my sons. Some storms are stronger than others. I love to read fictional stories with characters living right on the coast. Nearly all those fictional seaside houses are blown or washed away by the end of the story. Sea doesn't care. It's a phrase in many books. When I come home from the beach and lead my life on land among books and kids and visitors, the time comes when I need to return to the sea. This wave-like rhythm back and forth and back again is what holds my days together. Time weaves through them like a yarn, back and forth. Sometimes I'm not even sure where I want to be more. I love to read about cultures like Makah Indians, where sea is their home, their land, while the coast is a dangerous place, or the Tlingits, who had 1,000 names for the sea, while the mountain peaks, as Jonathan Raban writes, in all their meaningless variety were unnameable for them. Do I have 1,000 names for the sea? Not that long ago, I started to live here and read about the sea. Now I feel like Mumin Papa, who wanted to write a big book about the sea, to write down the rules the sea obeys, make some order, understand it. But the more he watched, the more he observed, the less he understood. He was angry at first, angry at this stupid sea, until Moomin Mama helped him to realize that he loves the sea and has always loved it. That's why he moved to the lighthouse. That's why he wanted to write a book about it. And that's why what the Sea Library is about. I believe if you will fall in love with the sea, you will always want to protect it, to take care of it. But just remember that the sea doesn't care about you at all. Now there are 608 books in the library. And during the pandemic, a lot of them were borrowed by post. So anyone who wants a book can just find me, contact me, and I can send a book by post too, because it's harder to visit this place during the pandemic, but the books still keep floating around. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. That was really lovely, and particularly nice about that and talking about coasters, muses, the fact that I now want to jack in my job and become a sea librarian too. So thank you. I would really love to welcome my next guest, a very close colleague of mine at the School of Area Studies, History, Politics and Literature at the University of Portsmouth. Dr. Maggie Bowers. She is a senior lecturer in English literature. Her specialism is post-colonial literature, especially multi-ethnic, cross-cultural and transnational writing, and she has a particular specialism as well in magical realism. Maggie is part of a civic engagement project with her colleague Dr. Mark Frost, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. And it's called the Portsmouth Literary Map, and it is a sort of an interactive geolocated map which looks at the literary heritage of Portsmouth, but also the contemporary culture of the literary scene in Portsmouth. And you know, it's a really wonderful resource. I think it could be a model for lots of other types of resource like this, and so I'm really pleased to welcome Maggie today to talk to you a little bit more about it. Maggie, when you're ready, if you want to put your PowerPoint up and start when you're ready.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks, Mel, for that introduction. Yes, just to say a little bit more, yeah, Mark sends his apologies. Mark actually started the idea of the map and putting the details about Portsmouth literature onto an online map some years ago. And the project began to grow to the point where we realized that actually there was so much Portsmouth literature and it didn't quite fit with the exterior image that Portsmouth has as a city. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about that conflict, as it were, in this talk. I'll show you a few things from the map as well, but also delve into some of the themes and some of the writing around Portsmouth. And I'm very happy to say that we do have Portsmouth writers in amongst the audience today. Tom, obviously, having just spoken, but also Christine, I saw there too. So it's a wonderful community of writers in Portsmouth, but you'll begin to understand a little bit more about why I want to share it with you as I go through the presentation. Just momentarily, I'm aware for those of you particularly those up in Edinburgh, you may not be particularly familiar with the South Coast geography. And this image here shows Portsmouth itself. The city is situated on Portsea Island, and what you'll see is that Portsea Island is surrounded by harbour. On this side at the bottom of the page, what you have is Portsmouth Harbour itself, and on the other side where you've got more, as you can see, the sandy kind of mud flat, you have Langstone Harbour with Hayling Island sitting in the middle of that Tom was talking about just a short time ago. So The literature map itself, as Mel has said, we wanted to record the literary heritage of Portsmouth, but also began to realise that there's such a vibrant literary scene in Portsmouth, and that Portsmouth itself is such an incredibly creative hub that it goes unrecognised, and we really wanted to be able to be a part of many schemes across the city, actually, which are trying to promote and record this particular aspect of Portsmouth creativity. The map itself is there online. Anybody can go through to it. I'll just go through and show you on a separate page in a moment what it looks like, but you'll see there from the link where to find it. But I've got other links as well that you'll be able to use to go through the different project pages and things to be able to find the map as well. What's curious about Portsmouth is that it has one of the largest populations of writers in any city in the UK, particularly in proportion to the population. And if you look at the one of the maps that was produced some years ago called Places in Poetry, you'll see that actually Portsmouth as a city has one of the largest, I'm going to say, just because I haven't checked every single one, but I've been told it is the largest number of entries of poetry for any map in the country. We've got several writers groups, but of those, the writers groups generally in the city have over 400 members. And when you think about that, it's a city of about 200,000 people, you can really get a sense of the great creativity that exists down here. So with that, I'm just going to move into, oh, sorry, actually, you know what I will do? I'll just exit screen and then get you the map itself separately on a different screen, share screen for you. There you are. So this is the map. It's interactive. You can just randomly click on something, and okay, there we have, so Portsmouth Grammar School. You'll be provided with different information about the different figures who are associated with those particular locations. You can zip around the city and go and explore different places. It provides you with historical information about the locations, as well as telling you what goes on there at the moment. So for instance, down at the in this particular area, it's called Spice Island, we have events for the Book Fest and Articulation, which are two of the current festivals that we have. Book Fest coming up soon, so we've got a lot of interest and excitement around what people will be doing in the near future with that. So I'll just go back in. Sorry about the toing and froing with this, it's just that it's not possible to go through the links on the PowerPoint. So this city has an odd reputation in many ways. One is that it has a reputation for being a place that people lived in and moved on from, a place of departures. It's a city where constant movement and departure inform its stories. Fleets of Navy sailors from across the world sojourn and leave. Prisoners of war from the French wars and the American War of Independence are kept in prison ships here. In our time, tourists arrive and depart from France, Spain, and the Isle of Wight. And regrettably, the city has become infamous for the British press for its development of IS insurgents. And this is a city that was the departure point for the ships to sail to Roanoke and to take the first shiploads of convicts banished to Australia in 1787. And this was the city that, that Dickens, Kipling, Conan Doyle, and H.G. Wells left. But there are many of those who have stayed, and their stories are often elided, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to put together the map, to be able to show not only the Dickenses and the Kiplings and the Conan Doyles, but also those people who spent longer establishing themselves in the city, those people who maybe didn't stay long in the city, such as the African preacher John Jay, but who used his time in the city to become a writer. And what we wanted to do was to make sure that we included this broad sweep of different writers. As I said, both those who stayed a long time, both those who were born there, also those who went there to become writers or accidentally became writers once they arrived in the city. Again, excuse me while I just stop share and then go back to John Jay. So John Jay is an interesting character in the story of Portsmouth writing, because, as I say, he didn't actually stay very long in Portsmouth. He lived there for about 2 years, but it was absolutely a vital time for him that he was living incidentally just by the childhood home of Charles Dickens, just in the years just after Charles Dickens moved away from that particular street to a nearby street. But John Jay was actually one of the less known writers of slave narratives, and he was an autobiographer who was born in Africa and then was taken as a slave to America, to New York, but he managed to buy his freedom, and then he began to travel around, became a preacher, and he ended up traveling across the globe, really. But for one accident or another, he ended up in Portsmouth, and there he settled into an area of the city that is known for being the old port town, where you have a lot of the sailors, a lot of the people whose lives were associated with the sailors, some criminal and some not, living around that area. And he became a preacher who gathered very large congregations from that particular community to him. So a significant figure, even if one whose story of Portsmouth wasn't particularly long, but it was there that he became the person that we recognise today. So if I just come back out again. And I need to go into that. Sorry, as I say, there's a lot of skipping around. So Portsmouth itself has some curious aspects to it. I think Louis mentioned a few of these, and as did Tom, but I'll just talk to you about a few of them. So it was formed around about the 12th century. It became a major port by the 16th century, and then we know it as the home of the Royal Navy. Much of the town was created in the 19th century in order to be able to produce cottages for the workers, and that's produced in Portsmouth line after line after line of grid after grid of workers' cottages, the very typical housing for the city. The resulting city was particularly defiantly working class. And one of the curiosities of the actual Victorian city that was produced, particularly in the area of Southsea, where Tom's sitting right now, is that it was produced from a drained morass, as it's called, a drained salt marsh. And you have the Little and the Great Salt Marsh, the Little and the Great Morass. Currently, there's only a tiny bit of the Little Morass left, which is actually the canoe boating lake, which is a tourist attraction built in the Victorian era down in Southsea. Since then, Southsea, like the seaside resorts that Tom was talking about, was seen to be very much in decline. But with some recent successful renovations, there's been a bit of a flowering of a different type of Southsea. And that Southsea is one that is connected through to the greater creativity that we see coming from the particular city. But that's countered by a particular image that Portsmouth has received. So in recent years, Portsmouth has an unattractive reputation in the mainstream media. It's been seen as being the kind of the natural environment for an underclass of white, non-working, unhealthy, desolate, sometimes criminal people and violent people. And Channel 4 chose Portsmouth as its location for the programme How to Get a Council House, looking at the workings of Portsmouth City Council, facing with a shortage of housing, and particularly interesting in the sense that Portsmouth is the most densely populated city in the UK. Reason for that obviously being that the city is bound by the island upon which it sits. So I'll stick with this for a minute. Okay. So what I also wanted to draw to your attention, though, is this idea of there are so many stories of Portsmouth that are obscured. Portsmouth is a city that, like the contents of its saline mud that surrounds it, has a history of diversity that has been lost and obscured, overwritten by an association with the myth of the white British underclass, a common perception propagated by the national media. Portsmouth is often distinguished from other English port cities because of it being the home of the Royal Navy, instead of being one of the larger ports with, say, transatlantic ports such as Bristol and Liverpool. And the city image contrasts with that of the other ports such as Bristol, London, Liverpool, and that their association with a well-known imperial commercial history, long established ethnic diversity and cultural vibrancy. And the implication is often felt that Portsmouth, by want of its visible diversity, has been left behind by cosmopolitan sophistication. However, as you'll see from the Pompey Liverpool statistics that I've put up, these are taken from the 2001 and 2011 census, that actually there's the same proportion of people from migrant descendancy living in Portsmouth as there is Liverpool, as there was in 2001, as well as there was in 2011. All three cities increased their migrant population at approximately the same rate through that period of time. Because of the misrepresentation, the history of the establishment of an Asian British community in Portsmouth following the migration from Southeastern Africa in the mid-20th century is not widely told. And new migrants from Poland are forging lives for themselves in Portsmouth, faced with right-wing anti-EU sentiment in the same streets where echoes of the homemaking of the first Polish community in Britain in 1834 go almost unnoticed. So it's because of this that we then wanted to turn to, the writing of Maggie Sawkins, who is a significant poet in this city and whose work includes stories and poems in particular that draw upon the different communities who have settled within the city. So I can't get Maggie's up immediately. Just one second. Told you this is going to be a bit messy. So this is part of our blog, and what we have is not only the literary map, but also a blog that runs along with it, so that it's a place where the current writers of Portsmouth can showcase their work. We provide things like a monthly poem, also reviews of writers' new work. And this one in particular, I think, is one that speaks a lot about the Portsmouth that goes unnoticed. Although he came from the mountains, this much I learned. He didn't understand my words for snow. I fluttered my fingers in front of him, but he only saw the wings of birds. I led him to the window, wrapped myself in my arms at the shivering sky, but he only stared. It was slow and involved the elimination of sun, wind and rain, but we got there. Sometimes I think of him back at the border. I imagine his mountains, their fingers of shadow, the stutter of gunfire, the quietness of snow. So, sorry, it doesn't like to move on much. There we go. What I also think is particularly important, though, about this, effectively, these stories that are missed, these stories that are hidden, is also that it goes hand in hand with the geography of the island itself. The paradoxical and liminal identities of the cities with its literal sensibilities have produced writing that is imbued with the transience of life and the ghostly traces of stories in its streets and buried in the mud that surrounds it. The cities has inspired many crime and detective stories, including those of Conan Doyle, Graham Hurley and Pauline Rowson. A sense of geographical place is imbued in much Portsmouth literature, more so than many other expressions of urban identity. Portsmouth rather gains its inspiration from the water, the mud and the seeping tides that delimit and flow around it, sharing similar associations with locations such as Dickens's Kent Marshes or Graham Swift's Fens. The shiny sludge of silt and rotting seaweed that surrounds and encroaches upon Portsea Island has given the contemporary city a sense of its own grim degradation. And writers such as Jonathan Meades and Sarah Cheverton tell tales from the city that emerge from the morass and all its rotting material. Even when celebratory writers such as Sam Fox focus upon the aspects of the city life, she is drawn again and again to its shoreline and its shifting geographies to encapsulate the narratives that are exposed and obscured with each tide. One of the peculiarities of this island, though, is not only that it's created on its, it is only created on its land-facing side by a tidal channel about 20 meters wide, but on its seaward side, it sits in the Solent facing the larger island of the Isle of Wight. The geographical effect of the Isle of Wight on Portsmouth shores is a reduction in the strength of waves. The sea here does not have the violent effect found further west, but has a calmer tidal flow that shifts and smooths layers of silt with each coming and going. And the view of the sea is equally obscured by the Isle, reducing the psychological effects of the vastness of the ocean. You'll see here a picture of Langston Harbour, of the salt marsh that remains in that particular area. And this is when the tide is out. Obviously the tide comes straight and comes full up and fills this area, but there's always a sense of this mud that lies beneath. And that brings us to the themes that we find. The mud, the foul, opaque, filthy, ancient, threatening morass, the shoreline, shifting, transient, tactile, encroaching, the tide, seeping, transforming, renewing, obscuring, the salt marsh, an intermediary zone of stones and sand, grasses and seeping salination, an ever-increasing area where the land is dominated by the effects of the sea, and an island, an area of land bordered by water, forcing a Janus-based mentality of looking inwards into a limited and contained space, or looking outwards towards expansiveness and existential freedom, although somewhat contained by the Isle of Wight. Now, the little morass is, as you have a photo here of the actual Canoe Lake as it is, but which used to be the smaller of the two salt marshes that is underneath Southsea, has produced many inspirational pieces of writing, not least Sarah Cheverton's The Monster Beneath, which is in Portsmouth Fairy Tales for Grown-Ups collection, which is from 2014. And in it, she talks about a story of the father being taken away through his increasing erratic and violent mental illness. But as she mentions, that really she sees that it is something that is inherent in his Portsmouth identity. Before Portsmouth, there was the great morass, a swab of mud and seawater fed by the Solent and shaped, so they say, like a huge hand. Something dark and ancient lies there. As she says, dark mud runs through us all, cut us, and we're likely to ooze sludge and seawater blood. And here she sees her father being taken away in the story, taken away to Portsmouth's own Bedlam, for those still touched by the darkness beneath the great morass. Now, what comes also to our mind when we're thinking about the great morass and the degradation of materials that produces a dystopian effect of an idea of Portsmouth is also Jonathan Meades's Pompey. Now, Jonathan Meades actually isn't from Portsmouth, and this book enrages many people because of the way in which it portrays Portsmouth. But on the other hand, it actually fits very well with a lot of what Portsmouth writers produce. It's an extreme book, this one. It's overwritten, it's grotesque in every way, and it's a very highly unlikely story with unlikely grotesque characters. But at the same time, what seems to be very clear is that they're using certain images of Portsmouth to fix this story in place. The person who wrote the introduction, Simon Heffer, says, Portsmouth, the place brimful of freaks and monsters and restless social mobility for whom dystopian is an inadequate adjective. And that is a good description of Meades's novel and the way in which he portrays Pompey. Mel, how long have I got? Have I got
We've got be worth wrapping up in a minute if you can, please, Maggie.
Sure. Yeah, I'm very much close to that. Okay, so yeah, Meads's novel is it's an extreme story with some extreme characters, and what he does though is he's taking the grotesque exaggeration of the very derided image of Portsmouth, and which we find so frequently in contemporary media, and even so his narrator even says that this is what he's doing. The novel is grotesque, and yet at the same time it's firmly fixed in Portsmouth in a geographical realism. Meads uses actual addresses and locations. You'll see in this bottom quote here, the crouch grass waves in the breeze, the keen-nosed pack runs into the house for a feed. We can smell the sea as well as blood. And there are the lights of Pompey. Here is the cross, and here are the allotments at the back of Fratton Road. And what we see is the story of a character called Poor Eddie, who's kind of a psychopathic character, even though people think that he's rather naive and innocent. But he is ultimately he carries out a murder, and ultimately he is murdered himself in a crucifixion by vigilantes. And the story moves from seeing the city from above on Portsdown Hill to the end of the story, which is right on the seafront. And it seems to me that that kind of movement of the story places the real true story of Portsmouth at the seafront in that liminal space. And it's there that the narrator is able to look down from the hill and see Eddie's cross burning as he's being killed on the beachfront. Meads, as I said, his work is controversial in Portsmouth because he's not actually from Portsmouth, but there is something that is very much, it's very much set in Portsmouth, but it's very much set in Portsmouth in order to reflect the external image of Portsmouth. And we have very different attitudes, very different ways in which we can approach Portsmouth if one looks at some of the other writers who are taking more, as I said before, celebratory style, such as Sam Cox, who considers the personal relationship to the very small detail of geography. So that in her poem, Discover the Writer in You, the location on the beach is absolutely crucial because, as I said, it seems to me that there are so many writers whose writing has been produced because they're in Portsmouth, because they're inspired by Portsmouth. The city speaks in every crashing wave, or in the softest of ripples our stories begin. Here, pebbles are poems, shells are softened by the ocean to become the sweetest of sonnets. You and I write novels across the sands, right here, with our footprints. So just to wrap up, Portsmouth is presented by Meads as a space of darkness of human psychology, uncanny and grotesque. Inspired by its odorous mud, Meads repeats an image of Portsmouth that exists in the national imagination rather than the stories of those who actually inhabit its streets. Like the salt marsh that dissolves and thickens the land of Portsea with each tide, the stories of inhabitants of this island city, past and present, have their stories layered beneath the myths that are constantly overlaid. Yet the geography of this city has its contrary influence on each inhabitant, as Cheverton and Cox reveal. As much as the morass pulls at our feet to settle into the island mud, the smooth expanse of pebble and sea compels us to look up and out. Hence, Portsmouth provides a complex and inspirational setting that is rewarded by a rich literary response to place. Now then, for those who would like to have more information, there is the link there, but in order to get there, I'm just going to stop and go to my page. So we have a website as well called Writing Literary Portsmouth, and on it you can find the blog, but equally you'll be able to find links through to the map and to other resources that link us into and try to help us to promote the particularly special writing of Portsmouth. Okay. So I can put those links into the chat, I think is probably the best way of going about that. Fine. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Maggie. It's a wonderful project. I'm just going to read out some of the questions, and if anyone's got any questions for Maggie, please do put them in the chat. I did have it all marked up, and then the screen moved, so bear with me a second. Okay, so the first question is for Tom and Louis. Just thinking about my own experience of the South Coast idyll, particularly through my teenage daughters and their friends, have you looked at the way people construct a highly stylized beach life through Instagram, etc.? That's the first question.
Good question, thank you. I mean, as a 42-year-old overweight man, I'm probably not best positioned to answer questions about beach snaps on Instagram, but I take the point. Obviously, I'm aware of these sorts of fantasies of the beach that are kind of informed by kind of ideas about the English seaside, but also about, again, the sort of the exotic other, people's expectations, people's sort of ideas about Australia and Asia and Thailand, so tend to get sort of transplanted into a kind of English, sort of fantasy of the English seaside. I mean, I wonder if there's a kind of Freudian type of compensation going on with those sorts of images, and at the risk of being too Portsmouth centric, sorry for people who aren't from Portsmouth who may not be interested in Portsmouth, it seems to me that these sorts of idyllic pictures of people looking beautiful on the beach, with a blazing sun and the azure sea behind them, belie a reality that's actually a lot more kind of distressing, in the sense that, and this is a big theme of mine and Louis's work, is the threat of climate change, the real threat of flooding due to these rising temperatures that not just Portsmouth, but every seaside town in Britain is kind of at the front line of. In addition to, this is a particularly local problem, all this sewage that was pumped out last year, was it, that made, that just all the way around the Solent, and kind of made, like other people here, I love swimming in the sea. I don't look very good doing it, but that suddenly became, I didn't want to take the risk of going in the sea. So yes, it might be that we see these sorts of, I'm not an expert in the kind of discourses of Instagram and that sort of thing, but I imagine that from my knowledge of other sorts of discourses like this, the fantasy tends to become kind of emboldened as the insecurity about the reality grows, so that's, that would be my.
I think super quickly, we saw this kind of in an interesting way manifest itself in Sandbanks, which is a kind of wealthy area, part of Bournemouth, and we saw the kind of perfect, very lovely beach bodies and kind of hanging out by the beach, and then strangely enough, in that same space, there was this massive fight that these girls were having. So it really kind of, one of the strange things about our experience is that no matter if the circumstances were always perfect or everything seemed idyllic, there was always something that kind of brought us back to, sort of social ills of the seaside or some other economic, environmental aspect. So it's quite, those things were kind of that one moment where it seemed like we were looking at kind of, a kind of California beach scene, then was kind of interrupted by this this kind of pretty horrific sort of fight. So it's always, we found that kind of strange, it's always been shattered pretty quickly.
Thank you. I've got another, I've got lots of comments praising all the speakers on their wonderful presentations. So I can ask Louis, I can ask James if he would share them with you later if you'd like to see them if you haven't already. The question for Tom and Louis as well is about, would you like to place the narrative of the seaside as a marginal / transgressive place in the longer view? And then how far is your current picturing of the seaside communities part of a greater cultural tradition?
I'm aware all the questions are coming for us and we don't want to hog this, so I'll try and be quick. Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously a very sort of fairly long lineage of scholarship that posits seaside towns as a sort of carnivalesque sort of Bactinian space where the sort of normal rules and diktats of, you know, the daily drudgery of life are suspended so that people can, you know, this is especially true of in the sort of emergence of seaside towns in the 19th century, where people could get away from the factory or the mine and sort of let go and enjoy themselves. I mean, in terms of what Louis and I have witnessed so far on our, you know, in our field work, as it were, I think there's a lot of marginalization, and I think Louis talked about that. You know, we know both empirically in terms of what we've seen personally and the statistics that health outcomes are generally pretty bad compared to inland England if you're in a lot of seaside towns. We know there are problems with, you know, Bournemouth, Louis mentioned. Again, there's another dialectic there between the astronomical prices of properties in places like Sandbanks, and then up the road, you've got more drug rehabilitation clinics per capita than anywhere else in Britain, I think I'm right in saying. So there's marginalization. In terms of transgression, I'm not sure. I mean, you know, transgression and resistance, I'm not sure at the moment. I think, you know, whether that has become quite muted, and people, you know, the sort of people we met, Louis and I, seemed to have had the kind of fight knocked out of them for now anyway. But who knows, as the, you know, as social conditions worsen, things get more difficult because of climate change and flooding and things like that, there might be a kind of, you know, a new consciousness emerging from the seaside towns where people start to, you know, sort of challenge these norms. I mean, danger of going back to Portsmouth again, but very quickly, I would just say that, you know, Maggie spoke to this kind of conception of Portsmouth as being quite a reactionary, monocultural, sort of imperialistic place, and that's, you know, to some extent, you know, it's true that it is the centre of the Royal Navy, and, you know, there's often been a kind of conservative or Tory sort of mentality amongst a lot of people, but at the same time, there's a long history of sort of resistance to all that, you know, which is something I've written about in other on other sort of platforms, and, you know, people protesting against militarism, and people protesting, you know, for peace and social justice and things like that. So and that's continued on, I think, amongst young people. The universities expanding in places like Bournemouth and Portsmouth has meant that you've got perhaps a more kind of radical or transgressive demographic of people in seaside towns, maybe. So.
And just quickly, I would just say that in terms of representation, I think it's probably counter what's often done in the seaside, which is, I mean, at least, you know, kind of a literary perspective or a kind of artistic perspective, where it's either nostalgia induced, or, as some of the examples that Maggie kind of explored, is kind of sensationalizing some of the kind of maybe poverty porn, which is a sort of interesting kind of phrase. But I think what we're trying to do is, it's quite empathetic, really. We're walking and exploring and looking, and we're not sort of fictionalizing. We're very much trying to take a kind of granular approach to walking, seeing, recording, experiencing. So from that perspective, we're actually sort of, it's kind of eye to eye, so to speak. And I think that from a representational point of view counters probably most of your typical narratives. At least that's what we probably intend.
That's great, thank you, Louis. That sort of leads on to the next question, really, which was about the idea of walking, and whether it's walking around seaside towns, or walking down to the beach from your house, Anna, or whether that's, you know, physically via the map. And the person asking the question wonders whether, how would you contrast walking with, say, something like swimming or sailing? Is there a different consciousness maybe that's provoked?
Anna, you want to go for that one?
Well, I think it's interesting that walking is like, in my city, the map, it's like a long peninsula with lots of paths to get to the sea. After 5 or 5 meters is another path to walk to the sea, and just a few spots where you can go down with a car. So it's just like the only way how to get to the seaside. But to contrast with swimming, remembering the summer when I tried to learn to swim, I think that the biggest contrast is that the coast is this strange place where you can walk down and then you enter a completely different realm where you have to let the land go. Not only one leg, but also the other leg, and you are gravity free. And this living on the coastline, it's like you have the possibility to experience both ways of being on land, and maybe that's also one of the reasons why it's so magnetic, to be able to stand on this edge between two worlds, because swimming is in a way unnatural for us, but also it's like we were born in mother's bellies full of water, so it's also something that we are drawn to.
Maggie, did you have anything on that one?
Yeah, well, I think, as you probably picked up, the idea of the map is also that because you can have it on your phone, then you can actually navigate the city by walking around it and by clicking on the various parts of the map as you move around the city. You can make up your own walking tours, literary walking tours of the city as you're going. But yeah, there's something definitely different about the experience of walking. I mean, I think I've illustrated in the variety of literature that I showed you that different parts of the city, as you walk different parts of the city, will provide different types of literature. So that if you walk along the beach, then you'll predominantly be having people using that same kind of aesthetic that we find in Sam Cox's poem that we shared with you. But if you go further inland, or if you decide to walk along not the beachfront but the other side of the island and walk along the marshes, then the smells that you receive, the views that you are looking at of a very flat mud expanse with a lot of bird life and etc. But there's very different kinds of reactions that you'll have to those environments, and that comes through in the way people write about the literature. But similarly, as I think Louis and Tom was saying as well, there is that aspect, and actually somebody put in the comment that there is that aspect when you move into the more kind of urban part of the island, then yeah, the experience of being in a city where there might be overflowing rubbish, or there might be all kinds of different smells that you receive as you're walking along, the amount of space you have around you shrinks considerably. And so even though you're by the sea, you're not in contact with the sea in any form at that point in time. So it produces, again, very different type of aesthetic. So yeah, the different writers' routes that you can take around the city using the map very much reveal those different types of aesthetics and ways in which the writers approach the city itself.
Thank you, Maggie. I'm conscious that we need to wrap up now. Most of the chat has just praise for all of the wonderful talks and some interactions and provocations in terms of what the subject matter has been today. So I would love to thank my speakers today for Anna, for Maggie, and for Tom and Louis. I think James has probably got a couple of sign-off messages to just wrap up with, but thank you all so much for coming, and I really do hope that everyone enjoyed it and will come along to our next one. Thank you.
That was wonderful, everyone. I guess my only conclusion is that please keep an eye on the Twitter account, Coastal Seminars, where we've put up a thread of this. It will also be, we've recorded this and we'll be putting it up very soon. And we will share that there as well. And there'll be some new seminars for the coming year being announced soon. So keep an eye out for those as well. For now, I'll wish you all good day, and thanks so much for coming. And thanks to all of our speakers and to Mel for putting together what I thought was just it was just what I needed today. And I hope you all feel the same. It was wonderful and also very thought-provoking at the same time.